An introduction to the life and work of Walt Whitman. Today, Whitman is known as one of the greatest American poets, famous for developing free verse poetry and writing poems such as "O Captain, My Captain." However, most readers don't realize how intent Whitman was on identifying himself as the voice and poet of America. Born in New York in 1819, Whitman grew up during a time of intense American patriotism, just about 43 years after America declared its independence. Whitman spent most of his early life in Brooklyn and developed a love for the urban life and new industry that was growing in the States. Before Whitman's career as a poet, he spent years working as a publisher in printing houses and as a journalist for various newspapers. Before his love for poetry grew, he was a successful journalist and had many articles published. His wide scope of knowledge about the world and human nature may surprise some, since his formal education ended by the time he was 11. In his childhood, he was a passionate learner, teaching himself without the structure of formal education and gaining experience from exploring the world around him. Alongside printing and journalism, he also dabbled in various jobs such as teaching and fiction writing. Check out his novel, Franklin Evans, from 1842. But Whitman did not begin his poetic career until 1855 with the first edition of Leaves of Grass. By the end of his life in 1892, Whitman had published a total of 6 distinct editions of Leaves of Grass. This was his masterpiece. Though Whitman tried out formal poetry that was written in traditional structures throughout the 1840s, the free verse style that we read today didn't develop until he began writing Leaves of Grass. Many people believe that he was responding to Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, The Poet, which stressed how important it was for an American poet to come out of the woodwork and define the American identity in writing. Whitman was consistently committed to voicing the unique and growing American identity. He writes in his preface to the 1855 Leaves of Grass, "The United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem." In 1855, Whitman's first edition included 12 poems, all untitled. He entered into the poetic sphere with a purpose, to create a new style of poetry that could speak for all of America. With this goal in mind, he worked to represent a huge portion of American society, the working class. Equality, and furthermore democracy, were both important to Whitman from his first publication to his final edition of Leaves of Grass. From the poem Song of Myself, from the 1855 edition onward, he creates long catalogs that often include marginalized groups that were not usually written about. He writes, "I am enamored of growing outdoors, of men that live among cattle or taste of the ocean or woods." After this, Whitman published his second edition of Leaves of Grass in just 1856. 1 year later, the book added 20 new pages. Some scholars call this time in his life his bohemian years. During this time, he forged friendships with various authors and artists, including feminist and abolitionist writers. The third edition was published in 1860, and Whitman grew in popularity and infamy. Some of these poems received criticism because Whitman decided to include poems that were sexual in nature. You can check this out in his clusters Children of Adam and Calamus. In 1861, the American Civil War began. The war hospitals at this time were full of severely injured men and diseases. They lacked basic necessities, were overpopulated, and were often viewed as a place men went to die after being injured. Whitman served as a type of nurse, though his work was mostly based in encouraging the injured soldiers, reading to them, bringing them gifts, and sitting by their bedsides. He writes in the poem, I Sing the Body Electric, from the 1867 edition of Leaves of Grass, "I sing the body electric. The armies of those I love engirth me, and I engirth them. They will not let me off till I go with them, respond to them, and discorrupt them, and charge them full with the charge of the soul." As you can see, Whitman was deeply influenced by the war, even after its conclusion in 1865. He would continue to be an ardent advocate for democracy in America for the entirety of his life and career. Whitman published 3 more versions of Leaves of Grass during his lifetime, in 1867, 1871, and 1881. Today, Whitman remains one of the greatest poets of America, whose works continue to inspire readers throughout the years.